Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Around the Empire podcast is listener-supported independent media. Pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please like, share, and subscribe on YouTube. Giorgio Cafiero joins us today, and we talk about the civil war and the complicated foreign intervention in Libya. We first do a review of what's happened in Libya since the 2011 overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi, and then we try to sort out the situation in Libya right now. There's also an extra bonus question for patrons, episode 173 Extra, about the outlook for Libya going forward, whether it's likely to split or be used as a battlefield by larger powers. Giorgio Cafiero is the CEO and founder of Gulf State Analytics, a geopolitical risk consultancy based in Washington, D.C. His research interests include geopolitical and security trends in the Arabian Peninsula and the broader Middle East. He's a regular contributor to the Middle East Institute, Al Monitor, Low Blog, Inside Arabia, and The New Arab, and he frequently appears as a commentator on various media networks. He's also an adjunct fellow at the American Security Project, an affiliate of the MENA Center, and an analyst at the London-based advisory Rosa and Rubini Associates. Giorgio Cafiero is here, speaking to us from the DC metro area. Welcome to the show, Giorgio. It's so great to have you. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be with you.
So since this is the first time my audience has heard you on this podcast, if you would, just please take a few minutes to tell the audience about yourself.
Yes, I am a Washington, D.C. based geopolitical analyst. I focus on the Middle East and North Africa with my main concentration on the Arabian Peninsula and Persian Gulf. For about the past 5 years, I have been working for a company I founded, which is called Gulf State Analytics, a geopolitical risk consultancy that's based here in Washington. I travel to the Gulf region and other parts of the Middle East quite frequently. I work with a number of scholars, analysts, and journalists who are based throughout the Gulf, Europe, parts of the United States, and other regions as well. We are very busy talking to the media these days, frequently appearing on different networks, sharing our assessments, our views of many geopolitical security developments in the MENA region, also looking at many trans-regional issues, understanding how the Gulf region fits into a global picture. And we do a fair amount of consulting work for diverse types of clients. And as your viewers know, when you're focused on the main security and geopolitical issues in the Middle East, you are always busy.
I'm sure you are. Just to give you a little bit of background, we're going to talk about Libya today, but Libya is a complicated war, like Syria was, and in some ways similar. Now, my background, I haven't done a lot on Libya on this podcast, but not because I'm not interested in it. In fact, back in 2011, I was strongly opposed to the U.S. intervention in Libya. I didn't have any loyalties to any sides. I didn't have a lot of background knowledge. And I definitely didn't understand. I sort of knee-jerk supported the Arab Spring and what they were called rebels, I think, at the time, but I didn't really understand who they were. And after Iraq, I was shocked that we would be meddling in another country, rich in oil and resources, with military force again. And to make matters worse, it happened like on the anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. And that just really irked me. And at that point, I didn't even understand that there were some underlying agendas, that fighters and weapons would be funneled to Syria, things like that. And, I tended to side with the revolutionaries in the Arab Spring without much thought or knowledge about what was really going on. So I was in the extreme minority among my political friends and allies at the time, and I lost some friends over that. And it was an interesting, there was a lot of strong support among people on the left for that, what they saw as a revolution. And, I happened to be in coastal North Carolina in March of 2011, just as an aside, near a major Marine base down there. And, there were helicopters and jets flying. I mean, it was clear that it wasn't just going to be like a minor, a trivial military intervention, and that just really upset me too. So that was my position at the time. And actually, it's only gotten stronger. I still strongly disagree with that military intervention, just, to be open about my bias there. And as I learned more about what the agendas were, and of course, as the whole thing developed, the connections with Syria but I still don't know enough about that whole situation. I find it to be a conflict that is hard to find good information and good analysis, to be honest. And so that's why I'm going to ask you about it. Um, so I think it's probably worth it to go back and review the basics of that war in Libya in 2011 and sort of how it has set the stage for today's conflicts and power struggle. For, people who maybe aren't in the know, that Libya has heated up a lot. A lot of our allies are involved with conflicting interests, and I'm also curious about after 2011, the country fell apart. It was a rich country at that time. It was very wealthy. Like, why is it not anymore? What happened to the vast resources and of course the stockpiles of weapons that we know found their way through a rat line to Syria after Gaddafi's fall and death. So I know that's a big question, but if you would, if you could just sort of help us review that situation and now in perspective.
Absolutely. Well, Libya had an Arab Spring revolt in 2011, as did a number of other Arab states. Of course, for each country, the Arab Spring experience was unique. However, there were also some common denominators between all of these Arab Spring cases that I think are important to keep in mind. As we saw in some other Arab countries like Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen, Bahrain, Syria, and so on, there had been deep-rooted problems with authoritarianism, cronyism, nepotism, corruption, high unemployment, especially for youthful populations. And all of these factors led to many citizens protesting their ruling regimes. This left the United States in a little bit of an awkward position in most cases. Of course, as we heard so much throughout the 2000s, more so under the George W. Bush presidency than Obama's presidency, huge emphasis on bringing democracy to the Middle East and seeing to it that Arab countries move beyond dictatorships and embrace democracy, at least as the Americans understood it. Now, when there were calls for democracy in countries such as Egypt and Tunisia, which had U.S.-friendly dictators, United States was in a difficult position. It had to balance sort of its commitments to all these values that there was so much rhetoric about on one side, with more raw strategic interests that would be advanced through a continuation of Hosni Mubarak's rule in Egypt, given that he was very close to the United States. We could say he was a darling of the United States. So when the revolt in Libya began, the U.S. saw it as an opportunity for its interests to come into to overlap rather than conflict, because Libya was historically a country that the United States considered to be a geopolitical foe. Gaddafi's Libya was, it's not right to say that it was a satellite state of the Soviet Union, but in the Cold War, it leaned toward Moscow, and it was not on the U.S. side against the Soviet Union. Gaddafi was a major supporter of the Palestinian struggle, and he gave a lot of support to various non-state actors throughout Africa and other parts of the world who were challenging U.S. interests and the interests of U.S. allies. When it came to the conflict in Western Sahara, for example, Gaddafi was a big supporter of the Polisario. Gaddafi had a very warm relationship with the government in Cuba, led by Fidel Castro, so on and so forth. For all of these reasons, the U.S. thought that overthrowing Gaddafi's regime could result in a new Libya emerging that would be much more friendly to U.S. interests than the Gaddafi government ever was. And, to be fair, there was the government of Libya was waging a brutal crackdown on civilian protesters in the country.
Mm-hmm.
However, my opinion, also, this is in agreement with a finding that the UK Parliament reached. The Western countries that got involved in Libya in 2011, and just to be clear, when I say the Western governments, I'm really just talking about the United States, the UK, and France.
Mm-hmm.
These governments did a lot to exaggerate the brutality and the threat of brutality that the Libyan government of Gaddafi posed to these Arab Spring protesters. So again, there certainly was a violent crackdown, but through exaggerating how dire the situation was, these governments had a narrative that they were going into Libya, they're intervening in the country's crisis in 2011 as part of the so-called responsibility to protect. Which is a doctrine known as R2P. And so this intervention was sold to the public really on humanitarian grounds.
Right. Yeah, I remember that well. And I remember that things weren't that clear at the time. They're, of course, much more clear now. Like, I forget whether it was the day that Gaddafi was killed or the day that Benghazi was taken. But I remember seeing some reports on Twitter and places like that where you could get some raw information, but you never knew how accurate it was. I can remember people saying, like, hey, wait a minute, they're raising Al Qaeda flags over Benghazi. What's going on there? And I remember being shocked by that, if it was true, and really not understanding who these different militias were. And now this has developed, a lot since 2011, and we have factions competing in Libya right now. So, and we have proxies, and a lot of the factions were fighting through proxies in a covert manner, whereas over, I'd say maybe the last year, it has become a little bit more clear who's who, who's backing who, who's involved in play. Countries like Turkey are getting sort of overtly involved, and I've heard stories from people who were in Libya uh, in recent years that like everybody's there. Everybody's got fighters there. Not everybody, but a lot of countries do. And and then also there were times when I heard stories about the U.S. and France. In this particular story, that there was like a small base or more like a bunker where the U.S. and French troops were actually fighting. I were there with Haftar's people, so they were actually like, it seemed like they were on both sides. Maybe just from an intelligence. I don't really even. I still don't understand that story. So, as best you can, if you could sort of lay out who the factions are who are competing in Libya right now, and who are their proxies, and what are their what are the agendas and the goals at play here.
You're absolutely right that the situation has developed quite a bit over the past 9 years since Gaddafi's fall from power. After the Libyan leader fell in 2011, chaos ensued throughout Libya. And because the Gaddafi regime was heavily armed, when the government fell apart, many of these arms went into the hands of various actors throughout Libya, and they also spread elsewhere. For example, in 2012, there was a chaotic situation in Mali that involved a coup d'etat. Later, there was a takeover of the northern two-thirds of the country by some jihadist groups. This was all an unintended consequence of so many arms from Libya and so many Malian fighters who were present in Libya coming back into Mali. That's just one example of how the chaos spilled across international boundaries. Going back to the actual situation inside Libya, there were competing groups who had very different visions about the country's future. The disputes had a lot to do with what kind of role the Muslim Brotherhood was going to play in the country, how resources were going to be allocated, so on and so forth. Fast forward to 2014, the country bifurcates between two power centers, one based in Tripoli and one based in eastern Libya near the Egyptian border. The current conflict in Libya is a continuation of this civil war that broke out in May of 2014.
You're talking about the East-West Civil War, roughly?
Yes,
Okay, sorry.
Between a power center in Tripoli, where today the country's UN-recognized government is based, and then an alternative administration which is based in the eastern city of Tobruk. This government is known as the House of Representatives, although it is not recognized by the UN as a legitimate government. It is allied with General Khalifa Haftar, who is supported by a number of very powerful global and regional players. And I think it could be useful to go into a little bit of the history about Haftar and how he emerged as a very powerful figure in Libya.
For sure, yeah.
This brings us back to the 1960s, when Gaddafi himself was in the Libyan army, and he formed a clandestine group known as the Free Officers. This was a group that took inspiration from the Free Officers movement led by Jamal Abdel Nasser over in Egypt during the 1950s. Just as Nasser's movement of free officers deposed a Western-backed monarch in Egypt, the same thing happened with Gaddafi's free officers in Libya in 1969. And to be clear, Haftar joined the free officers in 1964, just 5 years before the revolution. So when King Idris, who was a Western allied monarch who had been in power throughout the 1950s and almost all of the 1960s, he was toppled by Gaddafi. And soon after the 1969 revolution, Gaddafi appointed Haftar as chief of Revolutionary Command Council. His relationship with Gaddafi was very strong at that point, mainly due to the fact that Haftar was super loyal to Gaddafi. We fast forward to late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, there's a conflict between Chad and Libya that is taking place. And toward the end of that conflict, there's a final phase known as the Toyota War, where Libya was intervening in Chad, and you had a conflict between forces in Chad that were pro-Libya and others that were anti-Libya. In the Toyota War, which again was the final phase of this conflict between Chad and Libya, Haftar played a very important role. He was the chief commander of the Libyan forces in that country. In 1987, however, Haftar got captured, and his Libyan forces were also captured. And for reasons that historians can't really seem to agree on, Gaddafi decided not to negotiate the return of Haftar to Libya. And this is really where Haftar's problems with Gaddafi got started.
Mm.
Haftar felt very betrayed by Gaddafi, and the forces in Chad, whom Haftar's forces were fighting, were backed by the US. And this is, of course, when Ronald Reagan was the president. Haftar had to make a decision. Either he could face imprisonment, or he could agree to turn his back on Gaddafi, whom he loathed by that point, and begin working with the CIA. This is when we really see the beginning of Haftar's mysterious relationship with U.S. intelligence, specifically with the CIA. The CIA was trying to plot an insurrection against Gaddafi's Libya that would be done from Chad. And this is why they wanted to work with Haftar, so that he could lead this rebel army against the Gaddafi regime. And Haftar first demonstrated his keenness for brutality during this period. The Libyans who were a part of this rebel army and who decided to abandon it, or who signaled that they were going to abandon it, well, they were executed. And this was when people began to see some of the viciousness that has defined Haftar throughout his life. Fast forward to 1991, a coup takes place in Chad, which jeopardizes Haftar's position in the country. He can no longer stay in Chad because of the outcome of this coup. So the United States comes to rescue Haftar and bring him to the DC suburbs, where he became a resident in Vienna, Virginia, where he lived until 2011. What was his relationship with the CIA during those 20 years, roughly 20 years? There is a lot of mystery that surrounds this topic, but many people are very suspicious, and for good reasons, that he was linked to the CIA, in part because he was living so close to CIA headquarters, and because he had vitriol for Gaddafi and had a vision of a post-Gaddafi future in Libya, which was totally aligned with U.S. interests during those years. And many people seem to be convinced that he was working with the U.S. to plot a regime change in Libya. Regardless of what may or may not have happened between Haftar and the CIA during those years, by 2011, Haftar saw the opportunity to return to Libya, which he did. And he joined forces with the anti-Gaddafi forces who were fighting to topple that government amid the Arab Spring. After he got back to Libya, and once the regime fell in 2011, he was kind of a nobody. And we didn't really hear his name too much during that period, and he was not one of the main actors driving events in that early stage of the post-Gaddafi era. Then comes February 2014. He attempts a coup d'etat in the country that failed. And not only did he fail, but he suffered some humiliation. He was laughed at by a lot of people. Many foreign governments did not take him seriously. You know, he went on TV and declared that this coup happened, and he got laughed at. However, his situation changed significantly 3 months later, which brings us to May 2014. He had assembled a group, self-styled Libyan National Army, which was made up of a number of former Gaddafi regime officials, a number of tribal figures, and others who shared some of Haftar's views about the problems that were taking place in Libya. And with the Libyan National Army, Haftar waged so-called Operation Dignity campaign. And at this time in eastern Libya, in the city of Benghazi, there were big problems with many militias. As you alluded to earlier, there were a number of Al-Qaeda linked militias. Some of these groups were extremists and very violent, very intolerant form of Islam that these groups practice, very hard line in their social and cultural norms and beliefs. And many Libyans in this part of the country grew upset, and they were very furious with militias that seemed to be absolutely out of control and totally unchecked. And the reason why many Libyans ended up supporting Haftar in Operation Dignity was that he promised to eradicate the militia problem. He was very anti-Islamist to the core. He was very much opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood. And he essentially said and made Libyans think that he was going to kind of replicate the model that came of the Egyptian model that emerged amid that country's coup d'etat in 2013 with the rise of Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. Basically, the idea was that Haftar was going to sort of create a Sisi-like government in eastern Libya and perhaps the whole country based on his ambitions. And while many Libyans opposed Haftar, especially the Islamists for obvious reasons, he did build up a significant base of support in the East, which definitely was connected to some success that he did have in terms of clamping down on the militias, disarming them, and essentially taking care of what many people saw as sort of a crisis of too many militias that were out of control.
Right. Now, the people who allied themselves with Haftar, they were at one time, were they still loyal to Gaddafi or his legacy? Or was it more complicated than that?
Some yes, some no. Libyan National Army was made up of different groups of Libyans who supported Haftar for different reasons. But yeah, I mean, to answer your question, there were Gaddafi loyalists who were very important to Haftar's ascendancy in 2014.
It's interesting that he was able to do that. He must be a charismatic figure of some sort, or I guess things were just so bad in Libya that people were looking for some solution, for some stability. The the big story, important story, is that a slave trade came about again in Libya. Who was conducting that slave trade? Do we know exactly who?
So when we look at a map, we see that Libya is the gateway between is the gateway from sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean,
right,
and by extension Europe. During the chaotic period that followed Gaddafi's ouster, many networks were trafficking humans who were not. The vast majority of these people were not Libyans. I mean, these were people from countries all over Africa who were trying to come to Europe to, escape extreme poverty or escape armed conflicts. And it's very, very tragic, but there have been so many cases of extreme human exploitation with people in Libya making profits off of this human trafficking. So within that context, we've seen a real crisis with slavery, which I think is really one of the biggest moral challenges that we have in the world today.
Yeah, for sure. So now, Haftar's in the east, and the UN arranged government is in Tripoli, and Haftar was moving on Tripoli. Now, Haftar has a lot of big friends, right? He's got Egypt. I'm not even quite sure I've got this right. The UAE, um, pretty openly, I think, supporting him. Egypt, Saudi Arabia more quietly, from what I understand. Russia, uh, definitely involved, but it's unclear how much they want to be involved. And then I guess France is he are the, France also backing Haftar? I have a hard time keeping
Yes,
track of who's backing whom.
yes, and some other countries too, but I think those are the ones you mentioned are the main backers which Haftar has.
And so they wanted a united Libya. Is that, why were they trying to move on Tripoli?
Yeah, so let's rewind just a little bit. The civil war breaks out in 2014. All the diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict fail. We come to April 2019. By that point, the civil war had not ended, but it had cooled down a little bit. And Haftar reignited the conflict by launching an offensive on Tripoli. He kicked this offensive off on April 4, 2019. His goal was very simple. He wanted to have the Libyan National Army move westward and take over Tripoli and other parts of western Libya. The campaign was called Operation to Liberate Tripoli. The Government of National Accord, which is the UN government, the UN recognized government in Tripoli, is made up of a number of actors, including Islamists. There are some Muslim Brotherhood linked figures in the UN recognized government. From Haftar's perspective, this means that the UN recognized government has terrorists and extremists inside it. And therefore, as Haftar has seen it, the GNA is completely illegitimate. And his government, the more secular-leaning government based in the eastern city of Tobruk, is the one that has the rights to govern Libya. And so he launched this campaign simply to topple the UN-recognized government in Tripoli. There was a lot of support from these countries that you mentioned, which had their own various reasons for wanting to see Haftar succeed. They gave him a lot of money, a lot of arms, moral support, diplomatic support, and he kept on moving west from April 2019 throughout that whole year and into 2020. By the end of 2019, it was looking as though Haftar would possibly succeed.
Yeah, did. Yeah.
We were not sure that the GNA could survive. The GNA, despite being recognized by the UN as Libya's sole legitimate government, has been extremely dysfunctional.
And they can like barely leave Tripoli, right? Don't they need security and support from other countries just in order to stay in place?
Yeah, the main supporter of the GNA is Turkey. While it is recognized as legitimate by the UN, it is really only Turkey that has given it a lot of strong material support, including sufficient weaponry to fend off Haftar's forces. So, without receiving direct support from as many countries as Haftar was receiving, the GNA was in a rather weak position. And from the perspective of Turkey, which has been supporting the GNA for many years, the situation was extremely dangerous. Turkey has its own interests in the GNA's survival. These have to do with many factors, from the energy interests in the gas-rich Eastern Mediterranean to ideological factors at the heart of Turkey's Muslim Brotherhood-friendly foreign policy. What happens? December 2019, January 2020, Turkey intervenes and basically saves the GNA. Turkish drones were critical to what happened, and the GNA forces were able to protect Tripoli from Haftar's onslaught, but they did more than that. They started pushing back against Haftar's Libyan National Army, and they started retaking more land between Tripoli and eastern Libya, with Haftar's forces going on retreat and being pushed back closer and closer to the Egyptian border. Now, what happened earlier this month was very important. The president of Egypt, Sisi, who is one of the most important backers of Haftar, made it very clear that Egypt has what he called a red line in Libya. This red line is the coastal city of Sirte, which is where Gaddafi was originally from. And there was an Islamic State chapter in Libya a few years ago that took control of Sirte. So it's very important to Libya, this city. And there's also a military base in Al Jufra. And as Sisi said, if the pro-GNA forces capture either Sirte or the Al Jufra base, Egypt will intervene to prevent that from happening. So far, there has not been an Egyptian intervention, a direct intervention to stop the GNA, but that could potentially happen. Many are debating whether or not Sisi is sincere when threatening to intervene, or if this is just a bunch of hot air and we need to think that his bluff has been called. I think that remains to be seen. But nonetheless, if there were to be such an Egyptian military intervention, that could definitely impact the balance of power in Libya. But what we can say today, as of right now, is that Haftar, while not defeated, he has been weakened severely. The GNA probably not set to take over all of Libya, at least anytime soon. Nonetheless, the GNA is in a much stronger position thanks to Turkish support. And Turkey has established itself as the prevailing and dominant power, if you will, the kingmaker in Libya. And this is definitely forcing many other Arab and European countries to begin looking at Libya a little bit differently because of the success which Turkey has had in terms of flexing its muscles to strengthen the GNA and also to deliver some, to subject Haftar to some very humiliating defeats in a number of battles that have put him and his forces on the retreat.
So is he losing support from all the countries who were backing him before?
No, he has not lost that support. What remains to be seen is if he will later. It is possible that some of these governments will get even more frustrated with Haftar than they have been and put someone else from the Eastern government in power. But as of now, Haftar is still the man whom the Egyptians and the Emiratis, the French, the Russians, the Jordanians, and the Saudis are supporting.
Now, I mean, it surprised me that Turkey would, well, I think it surprised the world that Turkey would intervene the way they did and overtly, although, of course, they had some you might say, problematic Syrian militias that, well, I mean, that's just a whole nother hornet's nest there. But, the fact that he was sending fighters from Syria, and they operate from part of Turkey too, sending them to Libya, it almost looked like he was getting them out of his own hair, But no, he was more serious about. I mean, that may have been part of it, but he was serious about what he was doing in Libya. It wasn't just, a way to divert fighters. And so I never really understood what was motivating Erdogan. And I also didn't know about the pipeline issue and the offshore gas issue that is apparently a much bigger subject than I ever realized. Is that easy to explain real quick? I know we're running out of time, but can you give us just a little bit of information about that?
Yes, I think it's important to realize that the Turks are scared of a geopolitical scenario whereby Turkey is isolated in the Eastern Mediterranean. You have a number of countries in this region: Greece, Syria, Egypt, Israel, Cyprus, that seem to be working together in certain ways. Not all of them in every combination, but there is growing cooperation between these different players, and they are supported by the UAE in terms of their efforts to counter Turkey's agenda in the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, if Haftar were to take over all of Libya, Libya would be another country in the Eastern Mediterranean that is sort of a part of an anti-Turkish bloc. So the costs that Ankara was willing to pay and the sacrifices they were willing to accept to keep the GNA from falling must be understood within the context of Turkey not wanting to become even more isolated in the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, at the same time, the Eastern Mediterranean is very gas rich, and there are conflicts. So far, this has not turned into any military confrontations, but there are disagreements over where these maritime boundaries should be established.
Okay.
In Turkey and the Tripoli-based government, so Erdogan's government in the GNA late last year signed an agreement that would create maritime boundaries in a way that would serve their interests, but would be very problematic from the perspective of Cyprus and Greece. And point is, for the Turkish GNA agreement to have any sort of connection to reality, the GNA would, of course, have to survive. And lastly, I would add another factor which has to do with ideology and a grander struggle that is taking place throughout the Middle East. This has to do with the role of Islamist parties, specifically the Muslim Brotherhood in Libya, as well as other Arab states. The government of Turkey is led by Erdogan's party, the Justice and Development Party, or AKP. While I would not call this party the Turkish Muslim Brotherhood branch, we can say that this Turkish party has a history of ties with various Muslim Brotherhood networks and movements throughout the Arab world. And since the AKP has been in power since 2002, Turkey has conducted a very Muslim Brotherhood friendly foreign policy in the MENA region. Now, the governments that lead the United Arab Emirates and Egypt are very opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood on ideological grounds.
Right.
In Turkey, among the Turkish leadership, there's a view that the Muslim Brotherhood is a legitimate party and it should be permitted to participate in democratic politics throughout the Middle East. In Abu Dhabi, in Cairo, the leaders have a view of the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, and specifically the Emiratis, more than anyone else, have worked very aggressively to eradicate the Muslim Brotherhood from the region, to make the Arab world a Muslim Brotherhood-free region. Libya is a major hotspot in this so-called Cold War between Turkey and the UAE. The UAE has been giving a lot of support to Haftar because he shares Abu Dhabi's hatred for the Muslim Brotherhood. Of course, when we go back to Egypt in mid-2013, there was a democratically elected Muslim Brotherhood-led government. The UAE, along with Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, did a lot to support Sisi after the coup. They gave him billions of dollars to sort of stabilize Egypt, and they made it clear to him before the coup that he would have their support. So from the Turkish perspective, these countries in the Gulf, chiefly the UAE, are behind an anti-democratic and counter-revolutionary agenda, and therefore Erdogan wanted to make sure that the UAE would not be able to succeed in terms of enabling Haftar to do to Libya basically what some Gulf states helped Sisi do to Egypt.
Right, right. Boy, this is complicated. I have about 20 more questions that follow up from that, and hopefully we can dig into some of these specific areas. As I said earlier, for our listeners, we deliberately kept this at a not exactly high level, but a higher level than we could have gone into, because each one of these threads that you could pull on are very interesting in their own right. But I think we need to wrap it up for that. But I do have a bonus question, which I've been doing lately for patrons. So the bonus question for today for you is, what is the big picture? What's your big picture outlook on Libya and your views on that? Do you think that it's likely that the country will be split apart? Or is it, I hope this isn't the case, but it seems like it already is. Is it likely to be, is Libya, the territory of Libya, to the people's detriment, likely to be used to wage battles between larger powers? The answer to the bonus question is in an extra bonus segment for patrons. So you can find that at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or at the website aroundtheempire.com. Episode 173 Extra. I'm not great at marketing, definitely not my forte, but I'm starting to provide more bonus material for patrons as is necessary for independent media like this, funded solely by listeners. And because I appreciate them and they make it possible to pay the overhead costs of the show and compensate at least a little for the labor that goes into it. So that's my tease. I hope that some of you will subscribe and support the podcast to get these kinds of extras. There's also some full episodes for patrons only. And this month, there'll be a new Discord channel. Hopefully some live streams for patrons only where we can talk about things among ourselves. And now I will continue with the interview wrap-up. All right. Well, thank you very, very much. And I hope that we can continue our conversation in the future, digging into some of these things. And I just really appreciate your ability to explain the situation and to, help round out this podcast too, in terms of the subjects and the regions that we talk to. If you would, let us know where to find your work, how to support you, and, any other things that you might want to say on how people can follow you.
Thank you. It would be wonderful if your listeners could check out my website, which is gulfstateanalytics.com. My company's handle on Twitter is the beginning of that, Gulf State Analytics. So GulfStateAnalyt. And my personal Twitter handle is Giorgio Cafiero, GiorgioCafiero. Okay, great. And I'll put links to all that in the show notes. Again, thank you so much and take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Giorgio Cafiero. Follow him on Twitter at Giorgio Cafiero, GiorgioCafiero. Also find him at gulfstateanalytics.com. Around the Empire podcasts, independent media, and your support's really important. Pitch in at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. I'm going to have some new ways of contributing very soon too. And you can find all of these links and everything basically at aroundtheempire.com. There are lots of ways to find and listen to the audio podcast, as I said, on the website aroundtheempire.com, on all mobile podcast apps. And you can also find it on YouTube. And if you are listening on YouTube, don't forget to hit the thumbs up, to like the video, and share and subscribe. Follow on Twitter at Around the Empire, and we'll see you next time. Take good care, everyone.